Hi, this is Dr. Flight, and in this segment, we're going to spend some time looking specifically at an attribute rating map, which is a perceptual map, and in particular, we're going to focus on a technique called factor analysis, and specifically, we're going to take a bunch of data from a survey and then the data being attribute or characteristic focused on products, and we're going to reduce the data by using factor analysis, and then using that data we'll plot brands onto a perceptual map, and that will help us make strategic decisions, and it'll also help us identify opportunities and potential product changes that we could make as we move forward in doing our product development process. In this segment, we want to take a specific look at attribute ratings maps, and in particular a technique called factor analysis, which is a statistical technique that we'll use in order to identify brands and the different attributes that they have relating to the customer. And how the customer perceives those attributes. So in this example that we'll walk through, we have swimsuit brands, and these brands will be measured through a survey, and the related attributes and features that they have will be rated by customers in particular. So 15 different swimsuit attributes or characteristics are identified and then measured. In this particular survey, in this example, there are going to be all 5 brands will be rated, and we'll use what's called a Likert-like scale, which is a scale that ranges from agree to disagree based on a series of statements. So this will be a 5-point scale, 1 being low, so that'd be close to disagree, and then 5 would be high, which would be agree. The questions that we'll look at in particular, or the statements that we look at, include things like attractive design, stylish, comfortable to wear, fashionable, I feel good when I wear it, and so on. So we have the 15 different statements here, which ideally what we'll do is we'll send this survey out to a group or a panel of consumers that are likely to buy swimsuits that would be in our product category. So specifically then, our target market would be the group of consumers that would look at this survey. This would be something that we do, again, at the early stages, product development. And what we want to try to identify are different features or attributes that the customer finds important to them, and ones that they feel rate well for us and well for our competitors. So based on this information, what we can do is we can look and see where our competitors are doing well relative to our brand, and where we may see opportunities lie that we could take advantage of if we make some changes to our product and make those extended types of product innovation changes with our particular brand or product. Okay, so this is the swimsuit questionnaire. The goal here is to send it out to consumers. We may have a couple hundred consumers do this or more. Again, they would rate all 5 of the brands. So each brand would have a score for each of these 15 questions by the respondents that take the survey. So after the survey is launched, we get the data back, and from the survey, what we want to do is identify, actually measure and score each question on each brand. So what we do is we find the average response for each attribute for each brand. And then we can use a technique called a snake plot to help us begin to identify trends in the data and trends in the questions by brand specifically. So the snake plot then helps us compare the brands that were identified in the survey by each attribute However, there are some caveats to this. If we have a lot of brands, the snake plot tends to be rather difficult to interpret. Here's an example of a snake plot, and this is of the data that was returned from the survey, and this identifies 3 different brands out of the 5: the brand Aqualine, Islands, and Sunflare. Those are the 3 brands that are identified on this snake plot. And then basically what we're looking at is the average score for each brand on each attribute. And so the vertical axis then is the rating 1 through 5, which corresponds to our survey. And this would be the average of all the respondents who saw the survey, and by each brand. Then the horizontal axis then has the 1 through 15, which refers to each of the different questions. We can look at this and just visually see that the blue line, which is the Sunflare brand, acts in a slightly different way than the Aqualine and Islands brands. So Aqualine and Islands snake plot suggests that they move fairly closely to each other by question, and they behave conversely from Sunflare. And so one would suggest, just visually looking at this, that Aqualine and Islands are probably pretty close competitors. They probably behave similar to each other. They're probably niched with maybe a specific target market that makes sense just for them. And this would be a very different type of consumer than Sunflare, perhaps. And Sunflare may be trying to create a niche of their own that is something other than the other 2. We can take the average data that we have here, and we can continue this, and we can actually go ahead and plot this into a perceptual map. Now remember, this is an attribute ratings perceptual map. The data that we get is directly from the consumer, and it's focused on the attributes that we've measured from the survey itself. So if we took 2 of the questions, again there are 15 questions, but if we only took 2 of the questions, and we started to plot them and look at where they might be on a perceptual map by brand, I've chosen ideal for swimming, which was question number 6, and I chose attractive design, which is question number 1. Again, in a perceptual map, we typically do this in 2-dimensional space. Occasionally there'll be a 3-dimensional space perceptual map, but in this case what I have illustrated here is a 2-dimensional map, which means we can only use 2 of the 15 different attributes. And we notice that Aqualine and Islands on these two plots, or these 2 axes, fall fairly close to each other in this region of the map. Sunflare, as we kind of surmised from the snake plot, is pretty far away from those other 2, not really grouped together with them. And so, we think Sunflare may be looking to attract a slightly different market niche. Whereas Aqualine and Islands are probably fairly close competitors. They are more functional in the sense that they're more ideal for swimming, if that's maybe a functional type of attribute. They're probably less fashion oriented or fashion sense minded, in the sense that they score lower, quite a bit lower than Sunflare on attractive design. Okay, so this is a way we can start using data gathered from consumers and begin to analyze our individual brands by consumer response. Moving forward, we again are continuing to look at the data and the process of putting the data onto the map. Again, that's one of those steps in the perceptual map process. So we take the individual questions, we average them together, typically by consumer or by brand, through each question. and then place them on the map. It's important to note, though, that with perceptual mapping, if I have a lot of attributes like we have here, I can create many different types of maps. In the previous example, we only used 2 of the 15 attributes. So, like, I could also use many more attributes. However, I'd have to have many more different maps. So that can get fairly confusing fairly quickly. In fact, it gets fairly challenging if you start to overlay more maps together. So I might have, like 5 or 6 or 7 or more different perceptual maps, and interpreting these maps simultaneously is quite a bit of a challenge, as you can imagine. Okay, so this process of using a snake map and then using individual items for a perceptual mapping is useful, but it also requires a fairly deep amount of time and interpretation to be able to take all that information separately and interpret them all together. So in research and in statistical analysis, we have a couple different methods that we can use. In fact, here, if we have 5 brands, 15 different questions, there are actually 75 different variables to compare. So that's confusing. So as we move forward, we look to do something called data reduction. This is fairly common in market research, and when we're analyzing different product attributes in particular. So there's 2 different techniques that we can think about. One is called factor analysis. And when we do factor analysis, what we're going to do is we're going to reduce the number of items. So the number of questions we have is 15. What we want to do in factor analysis is take away items or combine items that are similar to each other. Okay, so we want to use a statistical analysis that measures, and what we're really doing is we're looking at the variance of the data between items. So if 2 questions are very similar to each other, what we might do is just put them together and call them one item instead of 2 separate ones, and therefore we kind of combine them together to make one one thought that is expressed by both items together, reducing our data from 2 items to 1. Okay, so that's factor analysis. We want to take items that we're looking at and combine them together. Statistically, of course. The other technique is called cluster analysis, and again, these are kind of broad terms, but in cluster analysis, what we do is typically look to cluster together items that look together, that go together, and traditionally and commonly in practice, what we'll do is we'll take this from a respondent perspective and we'll group respondents together. Okay, so we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about cluster analysis, but I do want you to know about this term and this concept because it's super important when we start looking at markets and target markets in particular. When we look at target markets, we're looking at customers that behave similarly relative to our brand. So cluster analysis then, instead of finding the questions or the attributes that go well together, what we're doing is we're looking at consumers that go together that view our brand in a similar way. Okay, so there's cluster analysis and there's factor analysis. We're going to spend a little bit of time here talking about factor analysis and how it's performed and what its benefits are, though. Okay, so factor analysis then, it's a technique we use again from a statistical perspective. We will use something like a program called SPSS or Excel or SAS or Minitab or some other software package, and our goal is to go ahead and input the data in a spreadsheet just as you'd have it. So we have respondents who've responded to our questionnaire. That's typically the row. The rows are typically our respondents who are responding to the data. And then our columns are typically what their response is by question. So in this example, I'd have my respondents carried down the rows, but I'd have 15 different columns because I have 15 different questions. So that's how I would input the data into my software package. And then I'd run the software to do a factor analysis or a data reduction process. Now, when factor analysis is performed in your statistical software package, typically what happens is there are two different stages or steps that are typically performed that we can use as we move forward. The first step is called an initial factor solution. And in this step, what happens is the software pulls apart the data and reconfigures it or combines it so that similar questions are paired together. Okay, so not to get into the nitty-gritty and the details of it, but the statistical package measures the variance that is explained when groups of questions are paired together, and it most efficiently finds a group of questions that explains the most amount of variance. So in detailed terms, these are called eigenvalues. And again, it's the percentage of variance explained when questions are regrouped together into what we call factors. All right, so that's more or less the first step that happens. The second step that happens within the software is that for each question that falls within a factor, each question is given a score or something that's similar to a coefficient in like that you'd see perhaps in a regression. Regression betas are coefficients that show the significance of a particular question or item in a regression formula. Well, what happens here is the same type of coefficient is calculated so that you know how valuable or how strong each question is relative to the factor that the question lies within. Okay, so with the data that we have, when the data was put into a factor analysis software program, the following chart is sort of created, and this would be that first stage or that first step of the factor analysis process or the data reduction process. So what's shown in this chart are scores, which we call factor loadings from that first stage. And these factor loadings will indicate which questions would fall within which factor. So if we look at this, we look at the factor loadings for the first question, attractive design. And there are two factors that have been emerged from this data based on the software that was run. And the factor loading for attractive design is on factor 1 is 0.796. Okay, so basically what we're looking for is big numbers. These will typically approach 1. Every once in a while they'll actually go over 1, but typically we're looking at something like 0.5 or 0.6 or higher. So 0.796 certainly is higher, so it falls under factor 1. And if we look at the factor loading for factor 2, comfort, attractive design, it scores very low, 0.061. So basically what we're doing is we're looking at the data and the factor loadings, and we're determining which questions go each together with which factor. So if we look down here, we've got question number 1, question number 2, question number 4, 7, 9, 10, 12, 13, and 14. So if we're looking at these questions, we're looking at these big numbers, and we're looking to see how they each relate to each other. And what we're seeing is that these questions all more or less tell us the same story. They all talk about fashion. Okay, similarly, if we look at our second factor, which was determined here, we've got other questions that fall under this factor. Questions 3, 5, 6, 8, 11, and it looks like 15. Those all scored high on the second factor. And if we look at the actual questions being asked, it's comfortable to wear. I feel good when I wear it. Ideal for swimming. Easy to swim in. Comfortable to swim in. These is functional for swimming. These we can name this factor whatever we want. In this case, we've named them comfort or comfort in swimming or functional for swimming or something along those lines. These questions clearly measure something different than our fashion questions. And the statistical software used has identified two groups of questions, each significantly, contributing to their own specific factor. So now, instead of having 15 individual items, what we've done is we've combined the items so that they fall into two separate groups. So now instead of 15 different items that we could plot in multiple perceptual maps, we have two items or two composite scores or composites. One is fashion, one is comfort, and now we can use them specifically to place onto a perceptual map. So the next step then, so we've done this, right? We've gotten this idea that we've reduced our data from 15 down to two particular summarized factors. And so the next step then is to take our individual brands and find what we call a composite score for each of the different factors, factor 1 and factor 2. So what we'll do is we'll actually take an average score for the questions that relate to fashion for each of our different brands. We've got 5 different brands that were measured: Aqualine, Islands, Splash, Sunflare, and Molucca. And so the average score for the fashion questions for Aqualine was 4.36. Okay, the average score for the comfort questions for Aqualine were 2.48. So you can think of these numbers here, these averages, as composite scores for each factor for each brand. Now remember, before we had 5 different brands and we had 15 questions, which means we'd have 75 different cells, different variables here. We'd have our 5 brands, but across this way, we'd have 15 different columns, one for each question. Now, instead of 75 data points that have summarized the data, we have 10. We have 5 brands, and we have 2 scores for each one. So now, as you can see, when we go to do a perceptual map, an AR map, our attribute ratings map, we've reduced the data and got a much clearer picture or summarized picture in terms of what this data is going to be telling us. So with this, we can take these specific numbers here and we can add them in. This should not be 6.61. This is probably 2.61 or 3.61. So let's just, we'll look at the perceptual map and see what that was. But these would all be within the range of 1 to 5. And we can map these on to our perceptual map now. You'll notice that we have an axis called comfort and an axis called fashion. Okay, so those are our summarized factors. And we can go ahead and plot these specific brands onto this perceptual map, and we can get a good idea. So Aqualine and Islands are still fairly close to each other. Sunflare is still pretty far away from them. And then in between here, we have Splash and Molucca. Okay, so these are kind of in between. We have kind of a general trend where the brands are moving from left to right, top to bottom. We have some that are over here in fashion more so, some that are over here in comfort more so, Moleke Islands and Aqualine. Splash is kind of down here where they're less comfortable and less fashionable. So this is kind of an interesting brand because we might want to try to figure out what their goal here is. Are they the value brand? Are they the least expensive brand where people are just kind of what's going on there? Sunflower and Moleke may be more expensive because they have a little bit of a better rating on the things that the customers are looking for. We have Aqualine and Islands, again, a little bit more functional. But the point is that we've used all the data that we have and incorporated it into one perceptual map that can be more easily interpreted as we move forward. The last thing that I'll point on this is from a strategic marketing and brand development perspective. If we're looking to gain market share, there's a couple things we can do. We can look for spaces in the map that show areas where there's no competition. So this whole area in here is an area where there's no competition that I might want to move into in order to gain market share or gain customers who are being underserved. Here's another one down here. Now, generally speaking, if you have a map like this where the higher numbers are to the right and to the top, you want to move in an upward direction if you want to better serve your customers. That's not always the case. So down here we have more fashion but less comfort. So that would be a very specific group of consumers, and we'd fall just to the left of Sunflare. If we moved into this area, Sunflare would become a much stronger competitor with us, and we would probably look to draw some of their market share away from them specifically. If we moved up here, then we might be drawing some of Moleke's customers away from them, and we would probably be a higher priced product. We're offering better comfort and better fashion all at once, and it would move us into a different product, into a different market niche than we might already be in. Okay, so if we think about like kind of where we're going strategically and product development, then what I would have to do is build more comfort into my product in order for it to be desirable. And if I built more comfort in, I'd move up. And if I used more fashion designs, if I built more fashion sense into my actual products, I'd move over on the perceptual map. So this is really a super good tool to use from a design perspective when you think about like opportunity and finding opportunities based on what the customers perceive and overlaying where competitors are and where you think you can take advantage in the marketplace and in the industry in your product line. Okay, so why factor analysis? Why is this important for us to think about? Well, we know that it's customer driven. So it's customer centric because we're asking customers what their perceptions are. In a determinant gap map or perceptual map, sometimes we do this just using managers' perceptions. But in an attribute ratings map, we specifically want to get input from the customer. So that's super important. Moreover, we're taking a lot of data at once and we're reducing it using a statistical process where we're taking a complex set, and in this example 15 questions, and reducing it down to 2 composite factors. So it's making something very complex into something a little bit easier to digest and understand and make decisions from. Moreover, using a process like this allows us to track over time changes and how if I make a change in one attribute area, it's going to move me on the perceptual map in a specific direction. So I can actually measure that change. I can determine like how much more comfort do I need to put in my product in order to move it on the perceptual map. How much more fashion do I need to build into my product to actually move it on the perceptual map to fulfill some type of strategy that I'm looking to fulfill. So that's a big thing, and it's a good thing to be able to draw this from the consumer's perspective, which factor analysis allows us to do. We also, because we're using a perceptual map and because we're measuring multiple brands, we're able to compare our brands to other brands. So that's, multiple brand perspectives is a good way to think about our competitive, kind of orientation. It also shows where we're distinctively different, and it allows us to develop our positioning statement as we move forward when we try to sell our product. Factor analysis, again, because it's data-driven and is a well-known, kind of a well-refined statistical process, provides a very accurate way we can map our products. And if done well, or if done repeatedly, we can see how movements happen over time. So, like, I can do a perceptual map and go ahead and gather data today, and that gives me a baseline for where we are today. I can go ahead and make product changes, and 6 months from now I can do another gap perceptual map using factor analysis, and I can see where we are 6 months from now and where we have been from before, and we can see the change that the change in the map, the change in consumer perceptions that have taken place as a result of my product changes. I can also look and see what my competitors have done as well. So if I watch my competitors' movement, I get a very good idea of what their plan is or what their strategy is in their product development process. So perceptual maps have a lot of benefits. Factor analysis is one good way. That's very common. It's a common way for us to gather data and then create a perceptual map that reflects that. All right, so wrapping up this session, we talked about consumer data coming from surveys, the survey itself in this example. We talked about snake plots, the pros and cons of doing that, and we spent a lot of time talking about the process of factor analysis, and specifically the data reduction concept, where we want to take a lot of items and make them easier to understand, easier to interpret, and then use the data that we've gathered from the survey to plot onto a perceptual map where we are, and then use that data. And here's the key thing: we want to use that data specifically to form a strategy and to make product changes, like actually change attributes and features of our product in order to better serve the customer and move ourselves in a more strategically desirable position onto the map. All right, so that wraps up this segment.